for joining us for another edition of Forage Focus. On today's show, we'll be addressing 10 common questions that producers have when they're getting started grazing. Stay tuned. Will is a new guest on Forage Focus, and we're happy to have him here with us today. Will, could you tell us a bit about what you do in Pike County and why we have you on the show?
Yes, thank you, Christine. Like you said, I'm Will Hammon. I joined the extension staff in June 2019, and I graduated from Ohio State with my master's in agronomy, and I've got a background in farming, cattle production, hog production, and just recently been helping out a lot of the community members and the growers with a lot of their questions, and a lot of forage things coming in, especially with the summer we had, and trying to address their feeding regimen going through the winter.
It was for sure a rough year in agriculture all around, but in grazing we've had some specific challenges that aren't always addressed through a lot of the traditional agriculture avenues. So we've spent a great deal of time on Forage Focus talking about those things. And something encouraging is that we continue to have people who are excited about getting into grazing. Some of them have a background in agriculture, and some of them have no background whatsoever. So I don't know about you, but I get a lot of questions through my office about people who want to know what they need to do just to get started.
Yeah, I do too. They have a little bit of land, or they inherited something, and they want to do something with that land rather than just mow it all year. So
right, and I'm totally in favor of taking that land and making it useful, but we do need to consider what our ground has to offer and what we can realistically do with it. So we're going to address some of those top questions that tend to come up, and often the first thing I actually hear is about the animals. So what kind of animals should I have?
That has a lot of, that's one question, but there's kind of 4 or 5 that follow up with that.
Right.
How much land do you have? Can you develop, enough pasture to feed, X number of animals? What your end goal is? Do you want to put this in your freezer? Do you want to pet it? What is your kind of objective with these animals?
Right, and sometimes people are really specific about what breed they should get, what genetic lines they should look at, and a caution that we'd have for folks is before you get that specific, remember what it is that you like about that animal and keep that kind of at your core, because every breed association is going to tell you that their breed is the best.
Sure.
For whatever reason, and there's benefits and disadvantages to all of them. So keep in mind your goals, how those breeds fit into that, and of course what you like. You want to be proud of what you have to offer. So. Yeah. Whatever breed you choose, whatever species you choose, make sure that it appeals to you and also fits your market.
Yeah, and another thing is handling the animal. Is there multiple people going to be involved? Is it just you? Can you handle 10 cows by yourself? Or do you have help from another member from the community or family? So things like that go into consideration, or experience you had with animals in the past.
Absolutely. We're going to work through some more aspects that go along with that about what you need to have in place after you've chose your type of animal. Keep in mind the size of the animal, the temperament of the animals as well, and also where they're coming from. So wherever you're buying your livestock, it's good to have some verified information about genetics, what they've been eating, what they're familiar with. Often if we bring in animals, say, to Ohio that were previously in Colorado, they have trouble adjusting.
Sure.
Or if we bring southern animals north, they're not used to the same environment, they're not used to the same foods. So if that's something we want to do to introduce new genetics, expect there to be some adjustment time for them to get used to what you actually have to offer. And you may find out that they don't actually fit the system. So perhaps a more local source might be a better fit.
Absolutely.
Another question we get, do I have enough pasture?
That's kind of a loaded question. It just depends. How many animals you're going to have. Are you going to go full cycle with breeding and have birthing on the farm, or are you just going to finish the animals out and then just value or the land value or quality of pasture. You could have several acres of high quality stuff or a lot of acres of low quality, and that's two very different scenarios.
Absolutely. If you really wanted to come up with a number of how many animals can I have here or how many paddocks should I have, the best way to do that is go out and measure what you have. Gauge the species that are growing there. Figure out if you want to put in something new. But the best way to actually decide if you have enough pasture is to measure the dry matter that's growing there. There's multiple ways that you can do that, and the question of is it enough really depends on the type of animals that you have, how many of them that you have. It may be that you have enough for 6 months of the year, but the other 6 you're going to run short.
Yeah.
Or maybe you have enough for 10 animals, but not enough for 15. So yeah, it depends, but definitely consider that question before you get a bunch of animals to put
absolutely.
on there.
And you made a good point about, I have enough food for 6 months. Well, can you afford to supplement the other 6 months?
Yes.
And then is that 6 months of 5 cows or 6 goats, or what is your kind of animal of choice and a number of choice? Maybe you should just go with 2 of a species to have 12 months of feed. And that maybe that's not something they want to hear, especially right off the bat. But it might be more manageable, especially getting started.
Right. And then also keep it in mind your goals. Is this, your hobby that you're doing just because you enjoy it, or are you seriously trying to make money? Because you can always supplement the feed that's missing, but that can often be expensive. So that may cut into your profit. And if profit is a primary important thing, then scale back and make sure that you've got enough to cover your costs. But if this is mostly a hobby, make plans to fill that gap.
Yes.
Okay, so we've decided, yes, there's enough pasture. Now, what about fence? What do we need? How much of it?
Well, there's so many choices. Where do you begin? Different animals, may need a different style of fence. Can they go underneath of it? Can they go through it? Do we need to electrify it? Do we have any existing fence, to use or start with? Those are all kind of beginning questions with that.
We have some resources available online about things like fence laws, different types of fence, the cost of fence. Consider if you're going to be installing it yourself or hiring a contractor. A lot of those resources are available through the OSU Farm Management site. When it comes to neighbors and fence, there can often be some conflicts with that on whose responsibility it is to maintain the fence. A quick tip for you, if you have livestock and your neighbor does not, it's probably your responsibility to maintain the fence. So try to keep a good relationship with that neighbor. Talk with them about what you're doing on your side and where you plan to go with that. And if you need to make changes to how things are currently designed, get that in writing so that if a conflict does come up in the future, you can reference whatever it is that you've agreed upon initially. If you're going to use electrified fence, clearly you need to have a source of power to get that electric there. And there's multiple kinds of designs that you can utilize, lots of different types of electric fence if you're going to go with a temporary wire, polywire, electric netting, or if you're going to go with a high tensile fence and electrify that, you can do that as well. Those will require different chargers.
Yeah, well, and to go along with that, proper grounding is probably equally as important as a power source. If you have enough adequate power, if it's not grounded correctly, you're not going to get enough, voltage through that fence, maybe at the other end of the field or even near the source of the power, if it's not grounded properly, and then you're not going to have as much efficiency as maybe cows can go through it or goats can walk through it or not as affected by the power going through it because it's not grounded properly.
Excellent point, Will. When we look at the reasons why electric fence fails, the number one reason is it's an improper ground. So right at the start, make sure you're getting it installed correctly, that you have enough grounds, that they're deep enough so that you don't wind up with animals out on the road causing issues. So the answer to this, and a lot of them, is it depends. If you need additional help, don't be afraid to call somebody out to take a look at what you have and what you can afford. Okay, we're managing pasture. Do I need fertilizer?
The question to answer this is it depends as well, and it kind of varies from field to field. And the first place you should start is with a soil test. Have an idea of what your baseline is, where you're at, and then kind of work through what you're removing from that field every year, or the animals are putting back on that field if they're grazing it, and then their manure is there. So there's a lot of things to begin with, but a soil sample up front is the best way to start.
Yes, absolutely. And if you go back on and investigate some other Forage Focus videos and guests, we had a really nice talk with Marcus McCartney about how to soil sample and how to read those results to figure out your needs. In a grazing system, if we are doing a good job as a manager, our fertilizer needs might be pretty low because these animals are going to help us distribute that manure.
Yeah.
But especially at the beginning, if you've not been on this ground for very long or you're completely changing the way it's being utilized, most likely you will need fertilizer of some type. But you can never know exactly what you need if you don't test.
Yeah. Well, and also different forages can provide some different fertilizers as well. So just the species growing in your pasture may be able to supplement some of those fertilizer needs just based on their plant functions.
What are some of those forages? Well,
legume crops especially, they can use nitrogen from the atmosphere, bring down to the roots, and then that becomes available to the plants growing around them. So something like a red clover or alfalfa is able to utilize that.
Even white clover can do that too. A lot of folks will have white clover already established in the pasture, and that has those properties as well. If that's a priority for you, make sure you're managing the pasture so that your clovers thrive. We'll talk more about different types of forages as we move along. Okay, so most pastures have some weed issues. What are we going to do about all these weeds?
Well, there's a couple of different ways to look at it. Do you want to use herbicide control? Do you want to use manual control or some sort of organic practice if that's the route you want to go? Those are all very different ways to control weeds. But weeds can be a big nuisance. They are able to grow faster than the crops you want to be in the field or in your pasture. And they can also take the nutrients away from those species you want in the pasture. So weeds are something that has to be managed. But what you're comfortable with or able to do are kind of ways to look at that.
Good points. And then if we go back to the previous question of do I need fertilizer? Well, if you need fertilizer and you don't provide it, most likely you're going to have a weed problem because weeds are scavengers of nutrients. They can find nutrients that other plants typically don't use, and then they'll rob what is available there from the plants we're trying to grow.
Yep.
So weeds are both a symptom of other problems and one that arises out of poor management.
Yeah. And it can really take over quickly. I mean, weeds, their growth rate is a lot faster than most species you want to have in the field. So even a small problem can turn into a big one very quickly.
Yeah, weeds are weeds because they found a way to work the system.
Yeah.
They reproduce quickly. They often have multiple modes of reproduction. They may reproduce both vegetatively and sexually, so they could likely produce seed, also spread through the root systems, or things like bulbs, and they can also persist in the soil for multiple years.
Yeah.
So it's going to constantly be a challenge. The best way to address that is through your management, how you move your animals.
Yeah.
And different types of animals will have different preferences.
Sure, they might eat around that weed and leave it there standing.
Right. And then if you think about goats, oftentimes goats will eat what we would consider weeds and utilize it as forage.
Yeah.
So multi-species grazing could be a strategy to help deal with those weeds as well.
Yep.
Another thing that we encounter is water systems. You have to have fresh water available if you're going to have grazing animals. There's many sources of water, some better than others. Is what we have sufficient?
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking cows, they consume a lot of water a day. I mean, they could drink 15 to 20 gallons of water per head. If you have 10 cows, that's a lot of water every single day. Do you have enough well supply, or is your pond deep enough, or what? However they're getting their water source, can you meet that requirement?
Yeah, I know that some people in my area, they depend on streams and springs to supply a lot of their water, which is good when we have rain.
Yeah.
But if we get a really dry situation, those springs may not produce as much. The streams may dry up. Our wells might not keep up. So having a backup source of water, whether you can haul it in or if you have the ability to tap into city water, can be helpful as a backup. We want to make sure that whatever water source we are using, that we're protecting it the way that we choose to have the animals access it.
Absolutely. And another thing is in winter months, if your water freezes, or the stream's not running as strongly that time of year, that could be another issue. How can you get water to these animals, even though I have a good supply during the summer? If it's frozen in the winter, then there's no water supply there anymore.
Yeah.
So having a plan for those times of year would also be very important.
There's lots of different types of water holding mechanisms that can help to prevent water from freezing. Things like coffin tanks can help. Those are partially insulated by the ground. You can get electric heaters that can go in as well to kind of prevent freezing. But those tend to have shortages. They may not always work, so they're probably less than ideal, but can be helpful.
And if you don't have electric supply to that area, if you're in the middle of a field or something like that, running electric underground is very costly. And if it's not already established there, that may not be an option to have some sort of heated source where that water is currently.
So however it is you make that water available to your livestock, make sure it's fresh, clean, and plenty to go around. If our animals are thirsty, they're not going to eat as much, they won't gain as much weight, and we'll see other health problems arise.
Yep.
Do I need a barn for these livestock? If you're just starting off and you're thinking about building a barn, that's a big expense. So are there ways to work around it?
Potentially. This is actually something I've had some questions about recently. What is sufficient shelter for livestock? And there's kind of some vague rules set by the Ohio Department of Agriculture, and a barn is not necessarily required, but you have to have sufficient trees or hill cover, or shade, or wind block. So that's kind of a tricky situation legally if you're not for sure on that.
Some of the things I've had conversations about related to barns as well are, well, if I build another structure, my taxes are going to go up.
Sure, absolutely.
Yes, they may, depending on what type of shelter you build. If you have smaller animals, you may be able to find some ways to build structures that are still mobile.
Yeah.
And then, therefore, you can avoid the additional tax that goes with that because they're movable. So there's multiple designs based on what types of animals you have to design structures that could be temporary or permanent. Do you have to have a four-walled barn that is as big as your house?
No.
Probably not.
No, you don't. But you have to have sufficient, shelter for the animals. The animal's a living creature just like we are. They need the food, shelter, water. Those are, essential core minimum standards. So a three-sided structure might be better than a four-sided. Open-faced, having it facing the proper direction so it's not getting weather blowing into it during different times of the year, and so, snow or rain or things like that. You could do something like that as well.
Yeah, and appropriate airflow is also important for that. So make sure that you've got enough windows or ventilation through the barn so that they can stay healthy. Okay, what about head chutes? We have this conversation a lot about working facilities and what's necessary and what's a luxury. What would you say, Will?
Is it a luxury? Yes. Is it a requirement? Probably so. If you don't have one personally, maybe you have a neighbor you can share one with. Maybe the vet has one you can borrow or rent. But if you're going to be handling livestock, you're going to need some sort of mechanism to work with them. And this is a way to control them. If you're going to give them vaccinations, if you have a sick animal, a way to kind of treat that or have control there. So what's your opinion on that?
Well, my opinion is, yes, you should get one. They are costly. Of course, there's a range of prices with all these types of things, but how much does a trip to the emergency room cost?
A lot.
So if your foot gets stepped on because you don't have appropriate restraint systems for your livestock that keep them safe and you safe, a simple, quick mistake could be far more costly than what it cost to install that head chute. So if you're in this for the long haul, make the investment and get one.
I would agree too, and it's something that's going to retain value. If this is something that a venture that you decide to get out of in 10 years or 5 years, that's going to still have value. You could resell it. You're not just going to be out that cost, but it is going to be very important to be able to have a way to handle your animals safely.
And depending on where you live and what the structure is of cost assistance programs, there are some cost assistance programs that can get you subsidized costs on working facilities. So inquire about those locally, what's available, and see if that works for you to reduce that cost. Okay, we alluded a bit to this earlier on what types of forages should I grow. There's tons and tons of options out there. A lot of that will depend on what we observed in your soil tests as well.
Yeah, and another thing to consider is, the maintenance of the crop. Is it going to require attention? Is it going to need reseeding? Is it going to need, cut at a proper time, and maybe that time doesn't work for you? So there's a lot of management strategies that would play into what's the best forage for my operation.
You need to make sure that whatever forage it is that you choose to grow, that it's going to meet the maintenance requirements for your animals. So there's some forages that put on a lot of growth. You can have tons and tons per acre, but if the quality is not high enough to sustain your livestock, that's not particularly helpful. Especially a good example would be in the dairy industry. We put a lot of demands on those animals to produce, and if we're not providing food that meets the maintenance requirement and also lactation requirements, we're not going to get the milk production that we need. It's going to cost us a lot to feed additional supplements. So keep that in mind, the nutritional value of the forages you choose to grow, their life cycles, timing of harvest, and if they're going to do well in the soils that you have. Yeah,
absolutely. And understanding like your nutrient requirements, as you mentioned, dairy cattle, even beef cattle. If you have a pregnant cow versus an open cow, there's a lot of different requirements there that are different time of the year. You might need a little bit better forage. If you have an average quality, we'll say you may have to supplement just because of their nutritional demands are higher during those times. So what you choose to grow has an impact on your herd.
Absolutely. And you can find out more about what would work best in your situation by talking with your extension educator or consulting the OSU agronomy guide. There's a lot of specifics listed about different common forage types. And one other piece of advice about types of forage would be look at the new and upcoming varieties. Don't just look at the species, because there's been a lot of genetic improvement on forages like many other crops.
Absolutely.
So pick something that's timely and don't just depend on the stuff that's been around for 80 to 100 years. Now let's end with this question. How can I market my product? There's multiple avenues for how you choose to market your grazed livestock. Depends on which one you want to meet. Often the conversations we have with people who are getting started, they have smaller goals. They want to sell freezer beef, for example. What are some of the steps to making that happen? So,
selling freezer beef, you got to determine when you're going to sell it, time of year. Are you going to sell that from home? Are you going to sell it on foot? Those kind of things play into role as far as inspections and different legal avenues. Selling it on foot's probably easier. You're selling this animal to somebody alive, and then they're having the processing done at a inspected and proper location at their expense. But if you're going to do something on home, or if you're selling it from home, you're going to have proper inspections, and that's through the ODA and USDA. Is that correct?
Yeah, and there may also be some from your health department.
Yeah. So having proper facilities, if you want to go that route, would be a big step to take. And I think some of those have expenses as well to be properly inspected and certified. There
are license fees that go along with some of those things. So make sure that you check everything off the list for whatever avenue you're pursuing. A lot of people might say, well, I just want to take it to the sale barn. And that's okay. You can track what's going through that market and what's bringing good prices so that you can remain competitive with the others at the market. And then there's also direct sales to like wholesale products. In that situation, pick out what wholesale market you'd like to go to and what they require. I would not get hung up on labels right at the get-go. the label like all natural or completely organic or grass-fed, make sure that whatever it is you're going to produce fits your market.
Yeah.
Those things may or may not matter to them.
Yeah, and understanding your market. If you're growing this product and you want to market especially like that, is that niche big enough for your region, for your area? Are you going to be traveling somewhere with these animals? Are you marketing across the state, across the country? And these are all kinds of things to think about. Those have expenses as well, and it may be a little bit more challenging to find a buyer or a user of that end product. And so understanding like you said, I think that's a great advice to not necessarily worry about that up front. Get your feet wet, get established, and then maybe kind of work into those avenues.
And of course, if you're only in the business to supply food for your freezer, that's a completely valid reason as well. You can be your own market if that's in your goals as an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for joining us today. If people have additional questions for you, your contact information is available there on the screen.
Yep.
Can they contact you by phone, email?
Phone, email, stop in, whatever works for you. Our address is on there as well. We're located on the fairgrounds right there in Piketon. Feel free to give us a call, email, or stop in anytime.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We do want to let people know that there's a couple upcoming events where a lot of folks involved with grazing will be. It's a great time to meet and socialize. And if you have more questions about forages, visit our beef team, our sheep team, or our forages team website to learn more. Thanks so much for tuning in. Catch us next time for another edition of Forage Focus.